There are secrets that do not die when the body does. They wait. They harden. They sit in darkness like a loaded weapon no one remembers placing on the table. And sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in a powerful house is not a gun, not a will, not a courtroom. It is a notebook, leather-bound, quiet, patient, written by a woman no one thought to fear. You were never supposed to hear this story. Because this is not just about a birth, it is about bloodlines, power, inheritance, and the fragile illusion of legitimacy that holds empires together. In the autumn of 1841, in Albemarle County, beneath the amber light of the Blue Ridge foothills, a woman named Harriet Voss arrived at an estate called Westmere. She carried a leather bag, clean linens, steel instruments, and the habit that would one day dismantle a dynasty. She wrote everything down. Not for money, not for revenge, not for politics. She wrote because she understood something men in tailored coats never did. The first breath tells the truth. Before reputations are manufactured, before names are polished, before fortunes are assigned. Birth does not lie. And on that plantation, ruled by Edmund Langford, truth was a liability. Westmere stretched across thousands of acres, tobacco fields, timber, dozens of enslaved workers, generations of carefully managed appearances. The Langford name was currency. It opened doors, closed investigations, silenced whispers. But Harriet moved between worlds. She entered bedrooms where powerful men were not present. She heard confessions spoken through pain. She saw faces at the moment life began, faces that did not always match the official story. And she wrote down fathers' names, not the public fathers, the real ones. For nearly 3 decades, she filled notebook after notebook, dates, times, mothers, witnesses, physical traits, and the name of the man responsible. Some of those names were explosive, because blood is power, and if blood is questioned, everything collapses. When Harriet died quietly in a back room after 27 years of service, the Langfords believed the past was buried with her. They were wrong. The notebooks survived. And once opened, they did not just reveal affairs. They revealed a flaw in the foundation of the Langford dynasty, one so catastrophic it forced a powerful family into silence. Listen carefully, because this is not just history. This is how power protects itself, and how one unnoticed woman dismantled it with ink. The first rule of power is this: the less visible you are, the more you see. Harriet understood that instinctively. At Westmere, she was furniture, necessary, useful, forgettable. She ate in the kitchen, slept in a narrow room off the back corridor, spoke when spoken to, lowered her eyes at the right moments. A midwife was permitted in places no man could enter, but she was never considered a threat. That was the mistake. The Langford estate operated on hierarchy. At the top stood Edmund Langford, landowner, patriarch, architect of generational dominance. Beneath him, his sons, Charles, cold and precise, Thomas, restless and unstable. Beneath them, wives. Beneath them, children. And beneath all of it, the labor that made the illusion possible. Harriet moved through every layer. She delivered the children of the plantation house and the children of the quarters. She heard the whispers of enslaved women who knew exactly which footsteps outside their cabin meant danger. She observed which young girls were suddenly reassigned to indoor work. She noticed when a wife stopped making eye contact with her husband. And she wrote. November 1841, her first birth at Westmere, an enslaved girl named Nora,
young, frightened, alone, except for Harriet and one older woman. The labor lasted 7 hours. The child was healthy, a boy. Harriet wrote the details with steady precision: mother, time, weight, condition. Then she asked the question she always asked quietly when the pain had passed and truth slipped loose from guarded lips. Who is the father? Nora hesitated. Then she said the name. Harriet did not react. She did not judge. She did not gasp. She wrote 2 initials: E.L. Edmund Langford. That was the first fracture. Not the first affair, not the first abuse of power. Those were common in plantation culture. But this was the first time it was documented, privately, permanently, beyond the reach of denial. Because the official ledgers recorded enslaved births as property increases, they did not record paternity. Harriet did, and that subtle difference is everything. Over the next 11 years, those same initials appeared again. Different mothers, same man. Edmund Langford built wealth from land and tobacco. He also built it on silence. And Harriet, without announcing it, without preaching or protesting, was compiling a parallel archive, a shadow genealogy, a truth map. Men like Edmund Langford believed legacy meant controlling the narrative. But Harriet understood something deeper. Legacy is blood, and blood leaves patterns. She did not yet know how those patterns would collide, but she felt it forming. You need to understand something here. Secrets inside powerful families are not accidents, they are infrastructure. And when infrastructure cracks, collapse is inevitable. This was only the beginning. Power does not fear scandal. It fears documentation. Affairs can be denied, rumors can be crushed, witnesses can be discredited, but ink is different. Ink waits. By 1845, Harriet had been at Westmere long enough to understand its internal physics. She knew who avoided whom at dinner. She knew which servants flinched at certain footsteps. She knew which pregnancies were announced publicly and which were managed quietly in the back quarters at night. And she understood the sons. Charles Langford was discipline incarnate. He moved like a man already practicing control over a future inheritance. Every word measured, every gesture calculated. He was being shaped for ownership. Thomas Langford was something else. Restless, easily slighted, a man who felt the hierarchy even as he benefited from it. He drank too quickly, spoke too loudly, burned through enthusiasm like dry timber. Where Charles was strategy, Thomas was appetite. Appetite is dangerous when combined with entitlement. Harriet watched him closely, not with suspicion, but with pattern recognition. Men who believe the world owes them something often try to collect payment from those with less power. In 1847, Charles married a composed young woman from a neighboring county. The wedding was immaculate, appearances preserved, alliances strengthened. 2 years later, Thomas married a widow named Vivien Carr. Vivien was different. She did not enter Westmere dazzled. She entered observing, calculating, adjusting. Harriet recognized it immediately, the same survival intelligence she herself carried. Vivien understood hierarchy, but she also understood leverage. And leverage, when applied correctly, can shift mountains. Harriet delivered Vivien's first child in the spring of 1852, a son, strong, healthy, named Robert. The birth was clean, straightforward. Harriet wrote the entry: Mother, Vivien Langford. Child, male. Father, Thomas Langford. Husband. Nothing unusual. But Harriet's instinct stirred, not because of the child, because of Vivien. There was something restrained behind her eyes during labor, not fear, not weakness, calculation. Harriet had attended over 200 births by then. She knew the emotional signatures of women in pain. Vivien's was layered. There was something she was carrying that was not physical. Harriet did not speculate. She recorded. Over the next 5 years, she documented more births across the county, and one in particular began forming a dangerous shape. In 1857, she was called to a tenant farm on the edge of Albemarle County. A young unmarried woman, Margaret Dyer, isolated, nervous. The baby was a boy, healthy. When Harriet asked about the father, Margaret whispered the name, Thomas Langford. Harriet wrote it. And in that moment, the structure began to shift. Because this was not about morality. It was about inheritance. Thomas had a legitimate son, Robert, and an illegitimate one, unknown to the estate's official record. But Harriet's notebook held both truths. Understand what this means. In a society where blood determined property and property determined power, one undocumented child could destabilize everything. Thomas never knew how close he was to exposure, but someone else did. Vivien. She had been watching too, and soon she would come knocking on Harriet's door, not for gossip, for confirmation. And when powerful women seek confirmation, it is rarely for defense. It is for positioning. The trap was being built. No one realized Harriet was the architect.
By 1859, the war had not yet begun, but tension was already in the air. Not just in Virginia, inside the house. Thomas had grown reckless. Debt followed him like a shadow. His absences were longer, his temper shorter, and Vivien had stopped asking where he went. That is always the moment to pay attention. When a woman stops asking questions, it does not mean she does not know. It means she is collecting proof. One evening, long after the house had gone still, Vivien came to Harriet's room, not as mistress to servant, as strategist to gatekeeper. She asked about Margaret Dyer. Not directly. She circled the name, tested Harriet's face, measured tone, watched for flinches. Harriet gave her nothing, but silence can confirm more than confession. Vivien did not need the details. She only needed to know whether the truth existed somewhere beyond rumor. And it did, in a leather-bound ledger under Harriet's bed. You need to understand something here. Families like the Langfords did not collapse from moral outrage. They collapsed from technicalities, from documentation, from legal vulnerabilities, from blood that did not align cleanly with inheritance law. In Virginia at that time, legitimacy was everything. A legitimate son inherited land, an illegitimate one did not. But if the legitimacy of the rightful heir could be questioned, the entire estate could be contested. Vivien understood this. Thomas did not. He operated on impulse. She operated on contingency. Over the next year, Harriet noticed something subtle. Vivien's kindness toward her became slightly warmer. Small gifts, extra courtesy, a tone of quiet alliance. Not friendship, alignment. Because Vivien knew something Harriet did not yet fully grasp. Thomas feared the notebooks. He had once gone to Harriet in private and asked if she recorded fathers' names. He was nervous when he asked. That detail mattered. A guilty man worries about records. But here is where the tension tightens.
Thomas believed Harriet had documented his secret with Margaret Dyer. He was correct, but that was not the most dangerous entry in those books. The most dangerous entry had not yet revealed itself, and it was not about Margaret. It was about a birth during the war, a birth that should have been ordinary, a birth that changed everything. Because in 1863, when Westmere was half empty, when chaos and scarcity and desperation altered behavior across Virginia, someone came to Harriet's room late at night, someone powerful, and asked her to keep something quiet. She did not promise. She wrote. That entry would later become the blade hidden in velvet. But Thomas didn't know that. He was afraid of the wrong secret, and men who fear the wrong secret expose themselves. The war would soon tear the South apart, but Westmere's true fracture line was already written in ink, and Harriet, quiet as winter, continued recording, watching, waiting, because power believes it can outrun the past. It never can.
War does not create corruption. It reveals it. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in 1861, the South convulsed with speeches about honor, sovereignty, and destiny. But on estates like Westmere, ideology was secondary. Survival was the priority. The enslaved labor force began thinning almost immediately, some fleeing toward Union lines, others disappearing in the quiet chaos that war makes possible. The plantation economy strained, supplies tightened, doctors left for military service, and Harriet became more essential than ever. Scarcity exposes character. Charles Langford tightened operations with cold precision. Fields were consolidated, expenses cut, social ties leveraged for protection. Thomas unraveled. He drank more, spoke louder, vanished for days, returned resentful. Vivien grew quieter. Harriet delivered 5 babies during the war years. 2 were born to formerly enslaved women navigating the uncertain border between bondage and freedom, 1 to a hired laborer's wife, and two required careful notation. The most important occurred in late 1862. The house was quieter that winter, half the staff gone, tension everywhere. Nights stretched long and thin. A woman from the quarters went into labor unexpectedly. Harriet was summoned. The birth was difficult, but not unusual. The child was strong. But before Harriet could leave, someone else arrived. Not officially, not announced. A man who did not belong in that room at that hour. Charles Langford. Not Thomas, Charles. Measured, controlled, composed. He asked a question too quickly. Is the child healthy? He did not ask how the mother was. That detail lodged in Harriet's mind like a splinter. Later, when the room was empty, when the candles burned low, the mother spoke quietly. The father's name was not her husband. It was Charles Langford. The man poised to inherit the estate. The man who spoke of order and responsibility. The man trusted above all others. Harriet wrote it. Mother, child, condition. Father, Charles Langford. And in that line, the foundation shifted. Because Charles had no surviving sons, his only boy had died years earlier, which meant the future of Westmere, its land, its identity, its symbolic power, was dependent on Thomas's line, on Robert, Thomas's legitimate son. But what if legitimacy itself was fragile? What if Charles's own blood ran elsewhere? What if inheritance was not as clean as the will would later claim? Harriet did not speculate. She documented. That entry would sit quietly for 7 years, unseen,
unquestioned. But when Charles later rewrote his will, leaving everything to Robert instead of dividing power, it would become clear he was correcting something or hiding something. Charles believed the threat was his own scandal. He had no idea the deeper truth could shatter the hierarchy entirely. And Harriet now held both, the impulsive brother's secret and the disciplined brother's hypocrisy. Power often appears unified. It rarely is. War would end, slavery would legally dissolve, but the Langford family's greatest reckoning was not political. It was biological, and it was written in a midwife's hand. The blade was forged. No one knew when it would be unsheathed, except, perhaps, Vivien, and she was preparing.
When a patriarch dies, the house inhales, not in grief, in recalibration. In 1869, Charles Langford's heart finally surrendered. No scandal, no drama, just a quiet collapse in the same house he had methodically controlled for decades. He arranged his affairs before the end. Accounts balanced, papers signed. Men like Charles do not leave loose ends, except he had. The will was read in the Westmere parlor under the supervision of the family attorney. The estate, what remained after war, emancipation, and financial contraction, would pass not to Thomas, but to Robert, Thomas's son. On one condition, Robert must complete his legal education and return to manage the property. Charles's daughters received money. Thomas received nothing new. Silence followed the reading. Not explosive silence, worse. The kind of silence that holds humiliation in suspension. Thomas did not shout. He did not protest. He went pale. Because this was not just financial rejection. It was moral rejection. Charles had declared in legal ink that his own brother was unfit to steward the Langford legacy. Now, understand the psychology here. A man like Thomas, already diminished by illness, debt, and resentment, does not process humiliation cleanly. He searches for leverage, and he knew something. He knew Harriet kept records. He feared what they contained. He assumed they contained evidence of his indiscretions, Margaret Dyer, the illegitimate child, the affairs. He believed Charles might have known. He believed that might be why he was cut out. Fear distorts perception. Thomas believed the notebooks were a weapon pointed at him. But he was wrong. They were pointed elsewhere. That night Vivien came to Harriet again. No pretenses now. She asked directly for protection. Not exposure, protection. She did not want Thomas ruined. She wanted Robert secured. Harriet asked one question. Why does Thomas believe he can challenge this will? Vivien held her gaze. Because he believes there are questions about blood. There it was. Blood, the most volatile currency in aristocratic systems. Thomas intended to imply that Robert might not be his legitimate son, that some hidden irregularity could destabilize the inheritance. He was desperate enough to risk the family name itself. But he did not understand the deeper risk. If bloodlines were scrutinized openly, the inquiry would not stop at Robert. It would move backward, toward Charles, toward that wartime birth, toward the quiet visit in 1862, toward the child whose father was the honorable brother. If Thomas opened the door to investigation, he would unleash scrutiny he could not control. Vivien understood this. Harriet understood this. Thomas did not. So Harriet made a decision that shifted her from passive recorder to silent operator. She copied specific entries, not all, just enough, and sent them, sealed, to Robert in Richmond.
not to expose, to warn, to equip. Power respects leverage. Robert, young but perceptive, understood immediately. If his father challenged the will, he would be forced to present counter-documentation, documentation that did not favor Thomas. The implication was clear: mutually assured destruction. Thomas withdrew his legal consultations weeks later. No explanation, just retreat. The estate stabilized, but something irreversible had occurred. Harriet was no longer just witness, she was guardian of equilibrium, and she had proven something timeless. The man who controls the record controls the narrative, and the narrative controls power. But the story was not over, because Thomas was not finished, and desperate men do not surrender quietly. They decay loudly, and decay spreads.
Desperation does not explode all at once. It rots. By 1871, Thomas Langford was unraveling in plain view. The humiliation of the will, the silent withdrawal from his legal challenge, the knowledge that his own son now held authority he never would. He had lost standing, and men raised to expect inheritance do not adapt well to irrelevance. He drank publicly now, gambled recklessly, spoke carelessly about hidden truths within the Langford line. At first, people dismissed him as bitter, but bitterness can become dangerous when it attaches itself to accusation. He began suggesting that Robert might not be his son, not directly, indirectly. Blood is complicated, he would say at gatherings. Not everything written is true. That last line was deliberate. He knew Harriet wrote. He did not know what she had shared. What Thomas failed to grasp was this: if he questioned Robert's legitimacy, Robert could question everyone's, including Charles, including him. Because Harriet's notebooks did not protect reputations, they preserved facts, and facts are indifferent. In the summer of 1872, Thomas made his final mistake. He approached a distant cousin, an opportunistic lawyer in Charlottesville, and floated the idea of reopening inheritance claims. The strategy was simple: cast doubt, force inquiry, intimidate Robert into financial concessions. It might have worked if Harriet had not anticipated it. Weeks earlier, she had quietly placed certified copies of 2 entries with a trusted church elder outside the Langford sphere of influence, one documenting Thomas's child with Margaret Dyer, the other documenting Charles's wartime child. Insurance. Not revenge, insurance. Because Harriet understood something fundamental. When powerful men panic, they destroy recklessly. She would not allow the estate to implode and take half the county's livelihoods with it. When word of Thomas's legal probing reached Robert, the response was swift and surgical. A private meeting. No shouting, no spectacle. Robert laid out the reality calmly. If Thomas pursued court action, documentation would surface. Documentation that implicated not only Thomas, but Charles. And once courts began examining bloodlines of prominent families during Reconstruction, a politically volatile period in Virginia, the consequences could extend beyond inheritance. Reputation, credit, social alliances, everything could fracture. Thomas listened. For the first time, he understood. He was not holding a weapon. He was standing in a powder room, and Harriet held the match. He withdrew publicly from all legal talk within days. The rumors ceased. He left Westmere not long after, relocating south, where distance could disguise disgrace. He died quietly 3 years later. No courtroom battle, no public scandal,
no newspaper expose. The Langford name survived, but its internal mythology did not. Because from that point forward, Robert governed differently. Less arrogance, more caution. He knew his authority was not divine. It was documented, conditional, and protected by a woman history would never credit. Harriet never published her notebooks. She never sought leverage for personal gain. She simply ensured balance. When she died in 1878, the ledgers passed to Robert with a single instruction. Truth is stabilizing when handled carefully. It is catastrophic when mishandled. He kept them locked, not to hide corruption, but to remember fragility. And here is the final truth. The Langford dynasty was not dismantled by scandal. It was reshaped by documentation. A midwife who wrote, a wife who calculated, a son who understood leverage, and a man who mistook fear for power. History remembers patriarchs, but power often shifts in rooms where no one is looking, where ink dries quietly, and where the most dangerous person in the house is the one taking notes.
Desperation does not explode all at once. It rots. By 1871, Thomas Langford was unraveling in plain view. The humiliation of the will, the silent withdrawal from his legal challenge. Thomas did not leave immediately. Men like him rarely exit with dignity. They linger, they test the edges, they look for weakness. By late autumn of 1872, Westmere had grown colder in ways that had nothing to do with weather. Robert managed the estate with measured calm. Vivien moved through the house with controlled neutrality. Servants spoke carefully when Thomas passed. Humiliation has a smell, and Thomas carried it. He knew now that documentation existed. He did not know where, but fear sharpens instinct. He began watching Harriet more closely. She felt it. The subtle pauses in the hallway, the way his eyes lingered on the small key at her waist, the casual questions disguised as courtesy. "Still writing everything down, Miss Voss?" She met his gaze evenly. "I record births, sir. That is my profession." Not a lie, not the full truth. One night, during a violent thunderstorm that rattled the windows and swallowed sound, Thomas acted. He waited until Harriet was called to assist at a neighboring farm, an uncomplicated labor that would keep her gone for hours. He knew her schedule. He had been observing longer than she realized. He entered her room. No fury, no smashing of drawers, methodical. He searched beneath the bed first. Nothing. Inside the trunk, linens, spare garments, old correspondence. He moved to the writing desk. Blank pages, dried ink, ordinary ledgers of expenses and deliveries. He almost missed it. The floorboard near the hearth sat half a finger width higher than the rest. Thomas knelt. He pried. The board lifted. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 leather-bound notebooks. His pulse surged. He opened the first. Names, dates, mothers, and fathers. His eyes scanned quickly, flipping pages with increasing agitation. Margaret Dyer. There. His name, written in Harriet's precise hand. He felt a brief, savage validation. So it exists. But then, another entry caught his eye. He read the father's name, Charles Langford. He froze. For a long moment, the storm outside seemed distant. The room tilted, not from drink this time, but from realization. This was not a weapon aimed at him alone. This was structural dynamite. If these books surfaced, they would not simply embarrass Thomas, they would expose Charles.
They would question inheritance decisions. They would invite courts during Reconstruction to scrutinize the legitimacy of one of the county's most prominent families. Creditors would circle, political enemies would pry, former laborers might press claims. The estate would fracture, and Thomas would not control the fallout. He would be consumed by it. He replaced the notebook slowly, wrapped it, lowered the floorboard. For the first time in his life, Thomas understood scale. He had imagined himself the threatened man. He was, in fact, the least powerful person in the equation. Harriet returned near dawn. She entered her room and paused. The air felt wrong, not disturbed, but aware. She walked to the hearth, kneeled, pressed the board. It settled slightly differently. She did not lift it. She did not check. She already knew. Thomas had seen, and he had chosen silence. That was the moment the balance locked into place. Not during the will, not during the confrontation with Robert. Here, in the quiet decision of a desperate man who finally understood that exposure was mutual. The next morning, Thomas avoided her gaze. Harriet offered none in return. No threat, no triumph, only recognition. The notebooks no longer needed to be wielded. They had been understood. And sometimes the most complete victory is not destruction. It is restraint. Thomas left Westmere within the month, not banished, not accused, simply diminished. Harriet replaced the floorboard that evening, but weeks later she moved the notebooks. Power, after all, is safest when its location is unknown, and ink does not forget.
The house held its breath. Westmere's walls had absorbed decades of secrets, whispers, and careful observation. And now, after Thomas's desperate intrusion, a new tension settled in, one that no one else could perceive, not fully. The servants continued their work. Vivien walked with her usual composure. Robert attended to the estate, unaware of the private earthquake that had just occurred. But Harriet knew. She had always known how power worked, how observation could be more dangerous than force, how truth recorded in ink could shape lives long after hands that wrote it had withered. That evening, she sat at her small desk by the candlelight, her back straight, her eyes scanning the room as if the shadows themselves might speak. She did not write, she merely contemplated. For nearly 30 decades, Harriet had chronicled life as it unfolded, quietly, meticulously. Every birth, every subtle revelation of who belonged to whom, every moment that powerful men sought to erase had been captured in the leather-bound pages she now guarded with an almost sacred vigilance. And yet, the encounter with Thomas forced a realization she had long resisted. The work itself had consequences. She understood the rules. Records were weapons when misused, shields when wielded carefully. She had recorded names and dates, but she had never considered that the ledger of lives could dictate the fates of entire families. The Langfords, once untouchable, now had vulnerabilities embedded in ink. And in those vulnerabilities lay leverage, not only for outsiders, but for the family itself, for the ones who had maintained their calm and discretion through decades of quiet authority. Harriet did not feel triumph. That was never her intent. She felt the gravity of responsibility. The notebooks were alive, in a sense. They had the power to destroy or protect. They had become a silent court, a tribunal that no human could fully command. And in that quiet, she realized that she was no longer just a witness. She had become an arbiter, a keeper of truths that men like Thomas could neither erase nor control. She also realized something else. Power, unchecked,
often invites catastrophe. Thomas's intrusion had been reckless, driven by a mix of fear, pride, and resentment. But the restraint he exercised, the choice to leave the notebooks where they were, revealed a truth about human nature. The threat of exposure can be more controlling than exposure itself. In the days that followed, Harriet moved the notebooks again, this time to a location so concealed that only she could access them. She began to see a pattern in how information functioned, how knowledge, carefully curated and discreetly maintained, could shift hierarchies without a single spoken word. And in the silence of her room, with candlelight flickering against leather and paper, she understood a truth she had long suspected but never fully embraced. Some power exists not in what you show the world, but in what the world does not know you hold. Here, in the quiet of Westmere, Harriet Voss had become something far more formidable than a midwife. She had become the axis around which truth and consequence would revolve.
The ledger's weight. Weeks passed, but the tension lingered in the air, invisible yet palpable. Harriet moved through Westmere like a shadow with purpose, her presence almost unnoticed, but her awareness acute. Every glance, every hesitant gesture, every subtle hesitation among the Langfords or the household staff was catalogued silently in her mind, waiting for the moment when the notebooks might demand action. She had learned long ago that observation alone could shift outcomes, and now, after Thomas's desperate inquiry, observation carried a new weight. She began reviewing her notebooks, not to read the stories, but to feel their weight. Each entry was a declaration of life, a defiance of erasure. Every birth, every name she had recorded in confidence was a thread in a web that the Langfords did not even know existed. Some threads were benign, almost invisible. Others, like Thomas's illegitimate children, were explosive. Harriet understood that these threads, if ever exposed, could unravel reputations, fortunes, even the carefully curated social order of Albemarle County. The paradox gnawed at her. She had always worked in the shadows, believing that neutrality and discretion were her shields, but the ledger demanded that she recognize its inherent power. Knowledge, once accumulated, was never inert. It had momentum. It could be weaponized, even unintentionally, and the very act of keeping it safe, hidden under lock and tin, had begun to change her perception of her own role. She was no longer merely a midwife tending to life in its fragile beginnings. She was a guardian of truth, and with that title came responsibility the likes of which she had never imagined. Harriet understood something else. Something colder. Power, unexamined, inevitably corrupts. She had spent years observing the Langfords, their ambitions, their obsessions, their blind spots. She had seen pride masquerade as honor, and kindness conceal calculation. Each careful note she made became a lens through which she could discern motives invisible to others. And for the first time she acknowledged that she wielded influence not by commanding others, but by preserving and understanding truths they could not see, truths that might one day determine the fate of the family itself. She began to test the edges of this influence quietly, a subtle question here, a nuanced observation there, enough to prompt reflection without revealing the ledger's full weight. Thomas remained volatile, restless, unaware that his own indiscretions were mapped in minute detail, every step documented in ink that refused to fade. Charles, measured as always, continued to manage the estate, oblivious to the invisible scales tipping beneath him.
and Vivien, perceptive and calculating, moved as she always did, though Harriet knew that she too sensed the currents shifting. In that dim room, the candlelight casting long shadows against the walls, Harriet realized something fundamental. The ledger was not just a record, it was a mirror. It reflected not only the lives of those it documented, but the very nature of power, secrecy, and human vulnerability. And in that reflection, Harriet saw herself, transformed from observer to something else entirely. The keeper of consequences, the silent hand capable of turning truth into reckoning. The notebooks had become alive, and Harriet understood fully that once a secret is known, it no longer belongs solely to those who wish to hide it. She braced herself. The world outside Westmere was moving toward chaos, and the ledger was ready.
The first whisper of reckoning. It began with a small, almost imperceptible shift, a glance exchanged in the parlor, a hesitation in the kitchen, the way the children of Westmere paused mid-step when Thomas entered a room. Harriet noticed these fissures immediately, not because she sought them, but because decades of practice had trained her to perceive what others ignored. The ledger was no longer inert. It was a quiet pulse in the house, a force that had begun to bend reality in ways the family could not yet comprehend. Thomas Langford's volatility intensified, and with it the exposure of his secret began to ripple outward in subtle ways. The children of the household, even those not yet aware of their inheritance or lineage, reacted to tension they could not name. Servants, once confident in their routines, began to adjust instinctively, sensing that someone or something was watching, recording, anticipating. Harriet's role as observer had shifted. She was no longer just a midwife. She was a silent arbiter of fate, and every action she took now carried consequence. Vivien's quiet maneuvers grew sharper. She began to ask questions with precision, probing corners of Westmere that were thought secure. Her intelligence was formidable, honed by necessity, and she recognized the presence of the ledger even before Harriet realized the magnitude of its power. It was not that she saw the notebook itself, but she saw the effect of its existence, the subtle shifts in behavior, the careful restraint, the small, deliberate silences that concealed as much as they revealed. Vivien had begun her own work, gathering truths, testing boundaries, preparing for the moment when the ledger's revelations could be wielded. Harriet watched all of it with a measured intensity. She understood the paradox. The ledger was her creation, her record, and yet it was no longer under her control. Knowledge, once preserved, gains agency. It flows, seeps into the cracks of human relationships, and waits for the precise conditions that will make it explosive. And in Westmere, those conditions were aligning. Thomas's impulsiveness, Charles's calculated calm, Vivien's strategic vigilance, they were the perfect storm, and the ledger was the hidden lightning rod. In her room, Harriet sat with the notebook open, tracing lines of ink that recorded decades of hidden truths. Each name, each birth, each moment of confided trust was a testament to lives lived in shadow, lives that had been deliberately erased from the public narrative. The ledger was a map of power, exposure, and vulnerability, and Harriet was beginning to see that she held the compass. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a chill that mirrored the tension within Westmere. Harriet closed the notebook slowly, her fingers lingering on the cover. She knew the quietest moments often presaged the most violent upheavals.
and in the stillness of that autumn evening she understood that the first whispers of reckoning had already begun. By now, the notebook had become more than paper and ink. It was a silent authority, a force field of truth that bent the behavior of everyone around it without a single word being spoken. Harriet had never intended to wield power. She had never sought it, and yet power is rarely asked for. It is claimed by those who keep records when others erase them, by those who notice when others look away, by those who understand what cannot be ignored. The births she had recorded were small events on the scale of history, but each one carried a weight most people never consider. A name, a date, a father identified or concealed. These were not trivial details. They were the building blocks of inheritance, reputation, marriage, and legacy. One line, written quietly in a dimly lit room, could unravel generations of carefully constructed lies. Harriet's meticulous hand had become an unseen architect of justice, even if the family it threatened had no notion of it. Thomas Langford, meanwhile, moved through the estate like a storm with no clear pattern. He drank, he gambled, he disappeared, but each action left a trace, a signal Harriet could read. His son, Robert, grew up unaware of the currents that moved beneath Westmere's surface, yet those currents shaped his very existence. Even Charles, disciplined, precise, and calculating, could not fully account for the ledger's presence. It was invisible and undeniable at the same time, a paradox of control that made the powerful nervous without a reason they could articulate. Vivien Langford's surveillance, quiet as it was, became increasingly acute. She noticed the subtle inflections in Harriet's voice, the hesitant glances of household staff, the unusual alignment of schedules and rooms. Harriet understood that Vivien was assembling her own archive in parallel, a collection of truths and half-truths designed to safeguard her son. It was an elegant and dangerous counterweight. Two women, each armed with knowledge the men around them could not perceive, quietly shaping the future of Westmere without confrontation, without announcement. Harriet sometimes imagined what would happen if the ledger were ever discovered, if the pages she had sealed so carefully were opened in the wrong hands. She imagined Thomas confronting the truth about his own indiscretions, the children of Westmere learning that legitimacy was often a fiction, and Vivien realizing just how much her control was contingent on Harriet's discretion. The potential was both terrifying and intoxicating. Knowledge, once recorded, gains gravity. It pulls at the world, bending it subtly, irreversibly. And so, in the stillness of the estate, Harriet continued her work, her eyes tracing lines of ink that bore witness to lives long hidden. The ledger was no longer hers alone. It belonged, in a sense, to the future, to the reckoning that would inevitably arrive. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying a foreboding chill, as if the estate itself were aware that its foundation was no longer entirely secure. The ledger's invisible gravity had begun its quiet, unstoppable pull.
The weight of unspoken truths. By 1861, Harriet had reached a stage in her life where every day carried the same rhythm, yet each carried a hidden tension. The Civil War was on the horizon, and even Albemarle County could not escape the currents of fear, rumor, and whispered allegiance. For most, the world seemed unchanging, the plantation rhythms predictable, the lives of the powerful insulated from consequences. But Harriet knew differently.
She saw the threads that others refused to acknowledge, the quiet anxieties, the unrecorded births, the moments of human vulnerability that power sought to erase. Her notebooks were no longer just medical logs. They were a chronicle of human truth in its rawest, most unvarnished form. She wrote with the precision of a scientist and the insight of a confidant who had glimpsed the machinery behind appearances. Names that mattered only in shadows were etched in ink, recorded with the calm detachment of someone who understood the weight they carried. The ledger contained alliances, betrayals, and a silent reckoning that no one else could read without risk. One line, one initial, one overlooked detail could shift the balance of influence in ways even the family patriarchs could not perceive. Harriet's understanding of power had grown with each birth she attended. She had watched the ways men wielded wealth as armor, controlling the fates of others while convincing themselves of their moral authority. She had witnessed the silent suffering of women trapped in roles society defined but never honored. And she had understood that the ledger, the simple leather-bound notebooks, was perhaps the only instrument capable of piercing that veil. It was, in its unassuming form, a repository of quiet rebellion, a subtle assertion that truth, however inconvenient, cannot be wholly erased. Yet the ledger was not a shield for Harriet alone. She carried the responsibility of knowing too much, of seeing the currents of power in motion, of understanding that a single misstep could expose secrets capable of destroying lives. The family around her remained oblivious to the danger that had quietly settled in the corners of their estate. They did not know that each recorded birth, each observation of hidden behavior, was a seed of potential upheaval. Harriet was the only one aware of the ledger's growing gravity, its silent dominion over the lives it documented. And as the nights lengthened and the war drew nearer, Harriet found herself guarding more than bodies in labor. She guarded the ledger, the truth, the invisible strings of consequence that connected names, dates, and deeds into a pattern that could not be ignored. Each page bore the imprint of a world most preferred to forget, and each entry carried the unspoken warning: power can conceal, but truth endures, and the ledger would ensure it. Harriet had learned to see without being seen. In the household of Westmere, her presence was unremarkable to most, a shadow moving between rooms, hands busy with work, eyes observing only what was necessary to maintain calm. Yet every gesture she made, every nod, every whispered word was a deliberate choice. She had become a silent architect of knowledge, collecting the invisible data that no ledger, no official record would ever reflect. She moved through corridors as though she belonged, but her mind catalogued everything: the timing of footsteps, the shifts in tone when certain names were mentioned, the subtle changes in posture that betrayed truth. It was in these silent movements that Harriet began to sense the depth of corruption that ran beneath the polished veneer of respectability. The Langfords, like many powerful families, relied on appearances, their wealth, their lineage, their connections. But appearances are fragile, easily ruptured by knowledge that exists only in ink and memory. Harriet understood that she carried the power to expose these fractures, not through confrontation, but through documentation. Each birth she recorded was a thread, each observation a node in a web that mapped influence, desire, and deceit. By 1863, the war had begun to cast its shadow across Virginia, and the household adjusted in ways subtle but telling. The servants whispered in the kitchen, their voices cautious, measured. The children of the family grew more aware, more anxious, sensing undercurrents of tension they could not name. And Harriet, as always, observed. She noted the changes with a steady hand, recording not just the medical facts, but the emotional landscape that accompanied each event. She understood that people reveal more under duress than in comfort, and that the ledger could capture truths that no court or confession ever could. But this was also a time of personal calculation. Harriet weighed the risks of her work, aware that knowledge is a dangerous currency. One misstep could expose her to anger, reprisal, or worse. The power she held was invisible yet potent, stored in notebooks that would one day outlast her and the fragile authority of the family she served. She moved carefully, maintaining the delicate balance between being indispensable and invisible, always knowing that the ledger was both shield and weapon. And in that awareness, Harriet realized something that few would ever understand. Real power does not roar. It whispers, it waits, it records. And when the moment comes, when the world believes itself secure in illusion, the ledger would speak. It would reveal not just who the family was, but who they truly had been, and what they had sought to hide. Every recorded birth, every quietly noted truth was a piece of the reckoning that could not be stopped.
Harriet understood the subtle violence of knowledge. To know and not speak, to witness and not intervene, is itself a form of power, a quiet authority that terrifies those who assume control lies only in wealth, title, or gunpowder. By 1865, after years of recording the intimate beginnings of life, she had amassed a ledger of truths so potent that its very existence could unravel the carefully constructed narrative of the Langford family. Names, dates, relationships, patterns, details that the world was never meant to see were inked in her notebooks, silent witnesses to the undercurrents of greed, desire, and duplicity. Robert Langford, now a teenager, moved through the house with the same measured confidence his father Charles once commanded. But Harriet noticed something different in him, a subtle tension, a watchfulness that betrayed curiosity and caution in equal measure. He had inherited more than the family name. He had inherited the unseen, the unspoken, the unrecorded. He had begun to sense the gaps between appearances and reality, the spaces where truth lingered just out of reach. Harriet recognized in him the same capacity for awareness that had guided her all these years, and she also understood the danger of that awareness, because secrets, once known, demand reckoning. A single word, a misplaced glance, or a careless record could set in motion consequences that could not be contained. Harriet's notebooks were more than historical accounts. They were instruments of revelation, and the people whose lives they chronicled were trapped in the subtle gravity of her observation. She had seen Thomas Langford's restlessness escalate into recklessness, and she had noted the patterns, the absences, the debts, the whispers of indiscretions that the household had worked for decades to bury. Each detail she recorded was a potential fault line, a fracture waiting for the right pressure to split the house in two. And yet she remained silent, not out of fear, but out of understanding. She knew that revelation has its own timing, that the wrong moment can destroy even those who deserve justice, and that patience is a weapon sharper than any blade. She wrote, she observed, she catalogued. Every name, every birth, every hidden paternity was a piece of leverage she might never use, and yet, paradoxically, that inaction gave her the ultimate authority. Those around her assumed she was merely a servant, a midwife, an observer of life's most intimate moments.
They did not understand that she carried the power to undo them all. In those years, Harriet had become a silent force, a shadow threading through every room, every secret, every unspoken truth. And she knew something few others could comprehend. The world is always more fragile than the people who think they control it. All it takes is one record, one notebook, to remind them of that fragility. And she held the proof in her own steady, watchful hands.
By the late 1860s, Westmere was no longer the household it had been under Edmund Langford's careful supervision. The war had fractured its labor force, reduced its wealth, and forced adaptation in ways that left old hierarchies weakened. Charles Langford had steadied the property with quiet discipline, but Thomas was a storm no ledger could tame. His bitterness, his recklessness, and the growing sense of being wronged had calcified into something sharp, something dangerous. Harriet recorded it all, not out of curiosity, but because she had learned that the smallest unnoticed details, the glances, the sighs, the hesitations, were often the earliest signs of collapse. Thomas's debts had accumulated silently at first, like rust beneath varnish. Each failed venture, each absence from Westmere, each whispered complaint or secretive conversation was a crack widening in the walls of the household. Harriet saw him at night, returning from the county town, eyes hollow from frustration, hands shaking with tension, body moving through rooms as though he were already outside of time, outside of consequence. And in those moments, she saw Vivien watching him, calm, composed, calculating. She was not naive. She knew the signs of a man on the edge, and she was preparing herself, quietly, for the inevitable collision of secrecy and truth. Harriet's notebooks, now spanning nearly 3 decades, had become something heavier than paper and ink. They were instruments of foresight. She could trace Thomas's patterns, map his weaknesses, and understand the ripple effect his choices would have on Robert, on Charles, and on the legacy of the Langfords. Each record she kept was a tether between the chaos of human desire and the order imposed by observation. To an outsider, these were mere details of birth, parentage, and domestic routine. To Harriet, they were the veins of power that pulsed beneath every household decision, every social maneuver, every calculated gesture of influence. The air in Westmere had changed. It was no longer the disciplined, ordered atmosphere that Edmund had maintained. The subtle rhythms that had kept the household aligned now faltered. The enslaved workers had gone, the hired laborers brought a new dynamic, and the land itself seemed to respond to the instability. Harriet's presence was the only constant, the only anchor. She moved quietly, her leather bag containing the notebooks under her arm, recording, observing, anticipating. And in that quiet, in the shadow of unspoken truths, she realized something. Power in this house no longer came from title, money, or social standing. It came from knowledge. The knowledge she possessed, the knowledge of origins, paternities, loyalties, and lies, was more potent than any deed Thomas might commit or Charles might enforce. The future of the Langfords, their reputation, their wealth, even their survival, could be rewritten by her hand. And yet she held back. She watched. She waited, because true power is not always exercised in action. It is exercised in restraint, in the patient shaping of inevitability.
By 1870, Harriet's notebooks had become something approaching a private empire of knowledge. Every birth, every whispered confession, every hidden connection, all carefully catalogued, was a silent record of human desire, weakness, and ambition. She had watched Thomas's reckless patterns continue unchecked, observed Charles managing the estate with a cold, methodical efficiency, and monitored Vivien's subtle strategies of survival. In every line she wrote, she held the unspoken truths that could topple a family, dismantle wealth, or ignite chaos. Yet she never wrote for drama. She wrote for precision, for preservation, and for the quiet certainty that one day knowledge itself would speak louder than any title or inheritance. Harriet understood, with a clarity that few possess, that truth is a force more potent than force itself. Power can be seized, wealth can be acquired, but a secret, once truly understood, has the capacity to shape every decision made by those who are ignorant of it. And Harriet's secrets were not minor. They were the invisible scaffolding upon which the Langford legacy rested. Every illegitimate birth she had recorded, every father whose name was whispered but unacknowledged, every child hidden in plain sight, represented a fracture in the carefully constructed veneer of the family's identity. She could see how, if revealed, these fragments could rewrite history, rearrange loyalties, and redefine who had authority over what. In the quiet of her small room, Harriet often imagined the ripple effect of disclosure. She imagined Charles discovering truths that would challenge his sense of order. She imagined Thomas confronting the exposure of his indiscretions, the debts, the failures, all laid bare against the meticulous record of his life. And she imagined Vivien, who had always been alert, whose quiet vigilance had already anticipated much, encountering the unfiltered clarity of Harriet's documentation. It was a power that could not be bargained with, reasoned with, or ignored. It existed purely because it had been observed, preserved, and protected in the hands of a single steady witness. Yet Harriet's knowledge was also a burden. With every page, she carried the moral weight of truth in a world built on suppression. She understood the cost of revealing secrets, the violence that comes when hidden truths meet human pride and fragile social structures. And so she continued, carefully balancing observation with discretion, keeping the notebooks safe, knowing that one day the world might demand their revelation, not for curiosity, not for gossip, but because the very foundation of the Langford family depended on the accuracy of her record. In these pages, she held the lives of men and women in balance, the legitimate and the concealed, the celebrated and the marginalized. She had become a keeper not merely of birth, but of justice, of reality itself, in a society built on appearances. And as the years pressed forward, Harriet sensed the approaching moment when her work would no longer be a secret she carried alone, but a truth that demanded to be known.
Vivien Langford moved through Westmere like a shadow with purpose. She was never loud, never ostentatious, but there was a weight to her presence that those who underestimated her would eventually feel. Over the years, she had learned the subtleties of the household, who observed silently, who deferred to appearances, and who allowed the pretense of civility to obscure the reality beneath. And in that silent observation, she had gathered her own intelligence, separate from Harriet's notebooks, separate from Charles's calculations, and certainly separate from Thomas's erratic impulses. She had learned that knowledge was currency, and she spent her years collecting it meticulously, quietly, and with an almost imperceptible cunning. Vivien knew about the children Thomas had fathered outside of marriage. She did not require Harriet's confirmation. Her understanding came from intuition, from observation, from the network of whispered stories that circulated among the women in and around Albemarle County. She had observed timing, mannerisms, subtle absences, and the careful concealments of a man who never fully grasped the scope of the consequences of his actions. Each detail was noted in her mind, stored with the precision of a ledger, ready to be deployed if necessary. And she understood the stakes. The Langford family's wealth, reputation, and control rested on a delicate balance, a balance that could be shattered with a single revelation. Her interactions with Harriet were deliberate. Small gestures of acknowledgement, polite inquiries, discreet gifts, each designed to maintain the midwife's trust, to observe without revealing, and to keep access to information uninterrupted. Vivien understood the invisible economy of secrets. Those who know too little are powerless. Those who know too much risk exposure. Harriet's discretion, her meticulous recording, was both a tool and a liability. Vivien recognized that if the notebooks ever left Harriet's control, the social architecture that protected Westmere could crumble overnight. And Vivien's position, as a woman whose authority was always contingent upon her husband's stability, meant she needed to understand every hidden variable before it could threaten her or her son. By the late 1860s, Vivien had turned this understanding into strategy. She watched Robert, her son, as a mother who saw not just a child, but the inheritor of a dangerous legacy. She prepared him, guided him subtly, ensuring he would be aware of what Harriet had preserved without ever revealing it outright. The careful shaping of Robert's perception was a silent instruction in survival, a lesson in discerning truth from performance, and a preparation for wielding influence over a family steeped in secrets. Vivien's quiet calculus was a form of power few could recognize until it was too late. She had no titles, no formal authority, yet she moved through Westmere as if she owned the invisible structures that governed it. She understood that control was never about force. It was about knowing, anticipating, and waiting for the exact moment to act. And in that patient observation, she had placed herself at the center of a web of truths, a web that one day would decide the destiny of the Langford name. Before we move on, take a moment to anchor yourself in this story. Comment the phrase, "I see the hidden truth," twice. This is more than engagement. It is a symbolic step, a lock-in to awareness, a recognition that you are witnessing knowledge meant to unsettle and transform.
The death of Edmund Langford Sr. had left a vacuum, a void in Westmere that no one could immediately fill. The estate was still intact, the land still fertile, the fields still productive, but the authority that had bound the family together, the invisible gravity that kept chaos at bay, was gone. Charles Langford assumed the public mantle, calm and deliberate, but even he could not control every subtle ripple that Edmund's absence created. Thomas, already unstable, became a slow-moving storm, his resentment simmering in every interaction, every failure, every deviation from the plan Charles maintained. And Vivien watched it all, absorbing every nuance, storing every observation, ready for the moment when it would matter most. Harriet remained at the center of this fragile ecosystem, a witness to history in the making. She moved through rooms that were shifting in authority, corridors thick with unspoken tensions, and families whose every decision was now layered with unseen calculations. She noted births with the same meticulous care, aware that each child's entry was a line in a ledger that would one day reveal a pattern no one else had the foresight to see. Her notebooks had become a silent architecture of truth, recording what the world preferred to forget, protecting what society would have erased. The stakes were no longer simply about life and death in the delivery room. They were about legacy, about the inheritance of knowledge, about the subtle shift of power from one generation to the next. Each whispered conversation, each carefully measured glance, each discreet gesture became a thread in a tapestry that could unravel the Langford family entirely if exposed. Harriet understood this instinctively.
She may have started her work with the singular focus of saving lives, but she now carried the weight of consequences far beyond the immediacy of childbirth. And the children born in these years, the unrecorded and overlooked, the ones who fell between the cracks of legality and propriety, were the true carriers of hidden truths. Names withheld, fathers unacknowledged, alliances unspoken, all stored in Harriet's careful handwriting. These were not simply entries, they were detonators waiting silently for the right moment. A misstep, a miscalculation, and the entire edifice of Westmere could collapse under the weight of secrets no one had imagined would survive. This is the reality Harriet lived with every day, the knowledge that she held the power to alter the course of the family's destiny without ever raising her voice. She understood the fragility of constructed authority, the way appearances could mask deep instability, and the incredible leverage hidden in simple observation. And as the decade progressed, she continued her work, every birth a line in the ledger, every observation a small but permanent shift in the balance of power. The question she faced, and that Vivien quietly grappled with, was not whether the truth should be told, but whether it could ever be contained once known. And in that tension lay the real danger, not in the violence of exposure, but in the quiet accumulation of knowledge that could, without warning, change everything.
By the late 1850s, Westmere had become a house built on shifting foundations, and only a few people understood how precarious it truly was. Charles maintained the illusion of order, the estate functioning smoothly under his measured management. Yet beneath the surface, Thomas's erratic behaviors, his sudden absences, reckless ventures, and growing resentment were cracks forming in the walls of the family legacy. Vivien, patient and precise, watched these cracks widen, cataloging every slight, every whisper, every small misstep. She knew that control was never truly about authority. It was about awareness, the quiet accumulation of understanding, the unseen leverage that comes from seeing what others refuse to notice. Harriet's notebooks had become instruments of power without her fully realizing it. Each birth she recorded was a record not just of life entering the world, but of the entangled relationships that nobody else dared to document. Illegitimate children, the secret names of fathers, the hidden connections, all invisible threads tying people together in ways that could undo carefully curated public images. She had become the keeper of hidden truths, a guardian of a history that, if exposed, could shatter the carefully constructed identities of Albemarle County's most influential families. The situation with Margaret Dyer had introduced the first undeniable fracture in Thomas's outward persona. Harriet's meticulous record-keeping captured it, quietly, without comment. Thomas was unaware that one woman, observing silently and writing with precision, could hold evidence potent enough to alter the future of his family forever. Vivien, aware of the rhythm of these hidden truths, began a subtle, silent campaign of her own. She moved with careful gestures, small acknowledgments, and discreet questions designed to confirm what she already suspected, that Harriet held the proof of everything the Langfords had sought to conceal. And the power of knowledge, Harriet understood in its cold, inexorable way, is cumulative. One secret can be contained, but decades of observation, carefully chronicled and preserved, cannot be undone. The notebooks, tin-lined boxes, and methodical entries became a lass of information, invisible yet unbreakable, a weapon whose existence alone could rewrite the social architecture of the county. Harriet's work had never been about vengeance or ambition. It was about fidelity to reality, an unwavering dedication to the truth that the powerful often fear most.
And now, with Thomas drifting further into recklessness and Vivien beginning her quiet orchestration, the notebooks were no longer just records, they were instruments of reckoning, slowly tipping the balance between concealment and revelation. And here is where you, watching now, must pause and acknowledge your own place in observing truth. To anchor yourself in this moment, type "I see what they hide" twice in the comments. This is not ritual, it is recognition, a conscious step into the reality that hidden systems govern more than you think, that observing them changes your awareness forever. This is the point where the quiet accumulation of knowledge begins to move toward action, where the consequences of recorded truth become inevitable. And Harriet, ever watchful, continues her work, knowing that every entry brings the invisible world of Westmere closer to revelation.
After that night, Harriet moved through Westmere with a new awareness, though nothing about her outward demeanor changed. She had spent decades perfecting the art of invisibility, being present without being noticed, noticing without revealing. But now every glance, every movement carried weight. She understood that the events unfolding around her were no longer merely daily occurrences. They were pieces of a larger, fragile puzzle, one whose edges were fraying. Thomas's recklessness, the subtle maneuvers of Vivien, the inherited expectations pressing on Charles and Robert, all converged in ways that only someone who had catalogued every birth, every secret, every whispered confession could fully see. It was in the smallest details that the power of her knowledge resided. A name recorded in a quiet moment could unravel a reputation decades in the making. A child's parentage, once hidden beneath polite conversation and formal documents, became a lever. In her leather-bound notebooks, Harriet held the truth of people as they were, not as they presented themselves. The powerful had spent generations constructing facades. She had spent hers dismantling them, one meticulous observation at a time. And that dissonance, the collision of the private truth and the public lie, was a force more dangerous than any weapon. Vivien, now subtly asserting influence over her husband Thomas and keeping close watch on the broader estate, had begun to act in concert with this invisible ledger of power. She didn't confront, she didn't demand, she simply maneuvered, asking questions in the oblique way that people who understand leverage do, listening for reactions, watching expressions, noting deviations from routine. Harriet's silent records complemented this strategy perfectly. Together, though unknowingly coordinated, their awareness formed a quiet but irresistible tide, an undercurrent that could shift the balance of authority in Westmere. Harriet, however, understood the gravity of her position. She was no longer merely an observer. She was a guardian of truths that, if released, would topple illusions, undo familial hierarchies, and ignite scandal. And yet, she continued her work without panic or drama. Each entry was precise, deliberate, unemotional, a professional's devotion to the unvarnished fact. She knew the notebooks themselves were more than paper. They were a form of psychological leverage, the kind of power most would not recognize until it was already in motion. And still, she remained invisible. She spoke only when necessary, moved only when required, and watched always. She had learned long ago that being underestimated was the truest form of protection. The powerful rarely fear what seems inconsequential, and in her quiet way she had become the most consequential presence in Westmere, someone who, by simply recording reality, held dominion over the secrets the living were desperate to maintain.
The war approached, the country shifted, but Harriet's eyes and her notebooks were the constant, the ledger that would not lie, the witness that no one could silence. And in that constancy lay an unspoken warning. Truth accumulates quietly, but when it strikes without mercy.
By the spring of 1860, the foundations of Westmere were quietly cracking. Not in the obvious ways, no fire, no invasion, but in the invisible architecture of loyalty, inheritance, and hidden knowledge. Harriet observed it all, her leather notebook swelling with entries that, on the surface, seemed mundane: births, deaths, illnesses. Yet beneath each line was the pulse of power, the tension between what was recorded and what was concealed. Every person in the house, every servant, every visitor carried a hidden story, and Harriet had catalogued them with the precision of a historian and the discretion of a confessor. Thomas Langford's volatility, once an occasional nuisance, had become a structural risk. His debts, his disappearances, his sudden irritations, these were not just personal failings, they were variables in a fragile social system. Harriet understood something the men of the household did not. Information is the only currency more valuable than money, and she alone held certain truths that could shift the hierarchy entirely. The family's respectability, their carefully constructed narrative, their inherited power, it all rested on assumptions she could easily dismantle, and she knew it. Vivien Langford, quiet and calculating, had also recognized the imbalance, though she could not articulate it. She approached Harriet with a subtlety that was almost imperceptible. Questions framed as casual inquiries, observations noted with casual attentiveness, attention paid to timing, absence, and gestures. Harriet, trained to observe without judgment, responded in kind. Their interaction became a silent dialogue of power. In every recorded entry, Harriet held potential leverage. In every withheld comment, Vivien gained insight. Together, consciously or unconsciously, they formed a network of unspoken authority, one that could influence the course of the family without overt confrontation. It was not paranoia that sharpened Harriet's awareness, it was experience. She had watched the mechanisms of denial, concealment, and suppression operate for decades. She had seen the way powerful men reacted when inconvenient truths surfaced, how reputations trembled, fortunes teetered, and marriages strained under the weight of what should never have been known. She had witnessed the slow, corrosive effect of lies and omissions, the psychological architecture of privilege and secrecy. And she knew that even the smallest entry in her notebooks could trigger a cascade of consequences. And so she continued her work with the steady precision that had defined her life. Each birth, each minor illness, each observation of household dynamics was recorded, catalogued, and stored. The notebooks became more than reference tools. They were instruments of truth, silent witnesses that no social convention could erase. And Harriet knew that the first tremors of collapse were already underway. All it would take was a spark. Before we move further, pause for a moment. Type "The Ledger Remembers" twice in the comments. Let the words anchor your awareness. This is not just a story, it is a doorway.